You're listening to a download from the outdoorstation.co.uk.
Number 321.
Hi and welcome back to another podcast here on the Outdoor Station. The heroes we see in the media these days, in my view, are spreading the wrong kind of message to those influenced by such things. Just because someone can kick a ball from A to B, or sing a quirky tune, or be locked up in a house with a bunch of other nobodies, doesn't make me want to worship them, even though the media seem to desire their 15 minutes should last an eternity. My heroes are people who can make a difference. Doctors, nurses, teachers, care workers, volunteers at every level. Those who give of themselves for no other reason than to share their abilities or love. In the outdoors world, we also have our fair share of media TV stars who travel first class between assignments, and to be fair, I guess they open up the outdoors to those indoors. However, if you had the opportunity of spending a day walking with one of your outdoor heroes, who would you choose? Well, David Lintern is a very lucky man, and in January 2011 he had the pleasure of spending a day walking in the Cairngorms with one of my heroes, Chris Townsend. Writer, photographer, blogger, conservationist, head of the Mountaineering Council of Scotland and long-distance walker extraordinare. This is the first part of a three-part series David put together for Resonance FM and the Outdoor Station, and I've no doubt you'll be glued to the conversation as we join them as they meander their way and discuss the first of three topics close to Chris's heart: long-distance walking.
It's a real pleasure to be here today with Chris Townsend, who's one of the UK's, probably the UK's best known long distance walker, and also a fantastic writer on the outdoors. Hi Chris.
Hi, thank you.
So just tell us a little bit about where we are right now. We're in the Cairngorms, but where are we specifically?
We're in Ribowen Pass, which is a narrow cleft in the hills with Scots pine, an open Scots pine forest either side of us, and steep slopes rising up above the trees to rocky summits.
And the weather, what's the weather like?
And the weather, it's a spectacular winter's day. There's fresh snow on the ground, which came down overnight and earlier today, but it's now cleared up. We've got the deep blue sky, the sun is shining, there's no wind. It couldn't be more perfect.
It's absolutely spectacular, it really is. Can't quite... I don't think we could, either of us could say quite how lovely it is. The Cairngorms, now, I mean, I'm a newbie to Scottish walking, but can you tell us a little bit about the sort of I suppose the geology of how are the Cairngorms formed? So you sort of background on that?
The Cairngorms they're granite, so it's volcanic, but of course it's been worn down over millennia.
So very old hills, and it's basically a plateau range. There are several huge plateaus dissected by deep valleys and deep corries with cliffs. So when you're on the actual tops, it's rolling, undulating terrain, stretching for miles. I mean, the Cairngorms has the highest area of land over, I think, 700-800 metres by far in Britain. But the edges of the Cairngorms can be quite steep. This is where you have, cliffs, and where, it's a glaciated landscape, and where the glaciers have cut away the edges of the mountains. Yeah, as I found out yesterday, it's getting to that flat top takes quite a lot of work.
Yes, yeah.
But it's every bit as lovely as I guess the more pointy western side.
Yeah, it's just different.
Yeah.
Yes, but it perhaps, as you say, it does require perhaps a bit more effort in that the western hills rise abruptly, often with a road close by. You tend to have quite long approaches
in the Cairngorms because it's such a much bigger area. So many of the summits, and if you take Ben Macdui, which is the highest summit in the Cairngorms and the second highest in Scotland, there's no short way to get to the summit of Ben Macdui. From any direction, it's a long walk.
Sure. Well, I haven't managed to quite get there yet. We did get up onto the plateau yesterday, and that was another spectacular day. Now, you're not from the Cairngorms. When did you move here?
I've lived here for 21 years now.
Okay. And why this particular part of Scotland? I mean, I'm assuming that Scotland was a choice for you because you're a walker, and this is a place to walk in the UK. But
yes, and because I wanted to come to the wildest place. I mean, I know people who love walking can also, some people like coasts, or even, or low-level walking, canal walks and things like this.
Sure.
So I'm very much most interested, in the wilder places and remoter places. And I must admit, part of the attraction of the Cairngorms for me is also the skiing.
right.
Not the downhill skiing at a resort, which
Really?
I'm not interested in, don't like,
No.
because otherwise people might think that's a bit odd. Wild remote places and the skiing.
Yeah,
But ski touring,
sure.
I mean, this is the best ski touring area in Britain, again, because you've got such a large area of land that's high up.
Yeah, and we saw a few of them. Well, I wasn't with Chris yesterday, but I saw a few of them up yesterday on the plateau, and it certainly looked like the best way certainly the quickest way to get around once the wind had dropped a little.
Definitely. And when the snow is deep, which it often is, it's by far the easiest way to get around. When you're going in knee deep on foot, it can be very laborious getting anywhere.
Yeah, it's
And on
slow.
skis, it can be easy.
Excellent. So what got you started on walking? Did you have I'm kind of interested in what kind of gets people inspired to do these things. I mean, obviously, there's the long distance aspect, which perhaps we'll talk about in a bit more in a second, but was there a kind of a catalyst? Did you have a teacher or a family member? Or
No. I think my family have mostly thought this was a bit odd. Certainly, none of them have ever done anything remotely similar, really. But I was brought up in the countryside, very different countryside to this, the Lancashire coast. But where there were pine woods, sand dunes, places to wander in. And I always enjoyed doing that from probably when I was so young I didn't even really think about why. It was just fun to play in the woods. And from that I developed an interest, in natural history. So I went walking in order to go bird watching and animal watching and looking at plants and trees. But I just found that, I enjoyed wandering around the woods and being in somewhere that seemed wild. And I didn't, this is when I was 10, 11, 12. I didn't in any way then think of it in terms of, even how far I walked or long distance. It was like, I'm going to go out on Saturday afternoon and wander around the woods and I'll come back again. And I would not have had any idea, of distance as meaning anything.
sure.
But then where teachers did come into it was at secondary school. Trips were organised to go hill walking. This was in the days, and I was lucky here, when you didn't have all the concerns over liability and health and safety and everything else. I mean, certainly some of the trips I went on, people would probably be in court if they did things like that now.
Right.
With one teacher with a string of boys in a blizzard crossing hills in the Lake District.
Yeah, we might have to. The HSE might be after those same people now.
But it did mean, and we were ideally placed. From where I was, Formby on the Lancashire coast. The Peak District, the Lake District, Snowdonia, are all within reach for day trips. So the school did, mostly about once a month,
teachers who were keen on this, would organise trips to take us out there. And again, as I say, it was much easier to do this in those days. And that's where I discovered, hill walking. As I say, the Lancashire coast is pretty flat. I think sort of 30-foot sand dunes, the biggest hills around. So going to the Lake District in Snowdonia was a real revelation.
Right.
Suddenly these huge, as it seemed then, rocky mountains. So that's where I got a taste for that. And of course, once you start being interested in hill walking, it becomes more serious. You've got to be a bit more organised. Navigation becomes more important. Equipment becomes more important. There's more skills involved than wandering around a flat forest.
Yeah. Initially, it was that experience, that sort of the being in a place, rather than the sort of okay, I'm going to do something which is going to take months and months, and it's partly about endurance and partly about sort of determination and all of these other kind of things that come into it, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, for me, they've always been secondary. I mean, it's always been the experience of being in a wild landscape that's most important.
Sure. And the other stuff is what it takes to get you there.
Yes, yeah, but not an end in itself. And there's also, which I haven't mentioned, which is important, is the camping. I enjoyed going camping from, an early age. I think I was 10 or 11 first time I went camping. And that's always been an integral part of it for me, which again is why I like backpacking and wild places. I wouldn't particularly, want to do or plan, say, a long walking trip where you stayed in a B&B or a hotel every night.
No. Nice occasionally, every few weeks, to stop in.
Sometimes.
And wash your socks.
Yeah.
But
You're listening to theoutdoorstation.co.uk. Award-winning producers of podcasts to inform, inspire and entertain lovers of the great outdoors everywhere.
you've just finished, or in the summer, the end of the summer, you just finished a particularly a walk in America. Can you tell us about that? Where was that?
It's called the Pacific Northwest Trail, and it runs from the Rocky Mountains in Montana west to the Pacific Ocean, and it's just south of the border with Canada. Sometimes it's only a few miles south.
Right.
Although it's called the Pacific Northwest Trail, I'd say this is an ambition rather than a reality. There isn't actually a trail as such labelled Pacific Northwest Trail. I think I'd walked over half of it before I saw any mention of it on the ground. So what it is it's a whole series of trails, some of them old abandoned trails, old forest roads, bits of cross-country, occasionally, unfortunately, highways, all strung together.
Okay.
And at the moment, there's no set route. I mean, there's plenty of places where you've got options and suggestions as to, where you can go. And I like long-distance walks like that because they're a bit more adventurous. There's a bit more of an exploratory feel to it than, a trail that is well developed, has been built, you've got signposts the whole way and so on.
What did you learn? What's different about that particular walk to the ones that you've done previously? Because obviously you've got quite a wealth of experience of these long distance walks. But what's different about this one particularly, you think?
Well, it's similar to some of the others. One of the differences I noticed was because, particularly for the American walks I've done, all the other American walks have been on a south-north, north-south axis. Now, when you do a long walk, and by long walk in these contexts, I'm meaning, you're talking a minimum of 700-800 miles.
Sure.
Most of them well over 1,000. Some of them well over 2,000. You're moving through different climatic zones simply by progressing north or south. This one went west.
Right.
So you don't in the same way, except that you're approaching the ocean and you're starting in an inland mountain range, so it does gets a bit wetter, but there was less change in vegetation and the forest and so on than in other walks, because I wasn't moving south or north.
Right.
I mean, when you do a long walk south to north, timberline changes.
Sure.
It's much higher in the south, but when you do a east to west walk, it doesn't.
Sure.
It's
So
the same, and the trees are the same. At the end of the walk, you're seeing the same trees at around the same height that you were at the beginning of the walk.
And I know you had some sort of. From what I understand, there was, despite the fact that that was the case, that there was a sort of climatic shift.
Well, I managed to choose a year in which there were extremes of weather, which is something I seem to do quite often, which makes me think that extremes of weather occur most of the time. But yes, initially, after the first week or so, there was then a big heat wave, and it was incredibly hot and dry, much more so than it usually is. The eastern area is drier anyway, because you're much further inland.
Uh-huh.
When we got to September, and I was getting much further west, the weather suddenly changed. Now, I knew that once I got further west, it was wetter anyway. You've got a mountain range called the Cascades, and in the Olympic Peninsula, you've got areas called rainforests, which tells you a bit about the weather. But even so, for most of September, it rained.
Right.
And it was the wettest September in Washington State for 30 years. So it was wetter than usual. So yes, I did go from, having to deal with extreme heat one week to having to deal with days and days of rain, just a week later.
Sure. So we were talking about long distance trips and specifically the Pacific Northwest. What other long distance trips have you made? I know you've made a hell of a lot.
Yeah, I won't go through them all because it's quite
a few.
quite a lot now. Yes. The unique ones, if you like, were the length of the Canadian Rockies.
Yeah.
Because that had never been done before.
Yeah, sure.
And here, the round of the Munros and Tops. Mm. Now, the Munros had been done in a continuous summer-long walk. Hamish Brown did it first and wrote a superb book on it, which was my inspiration. And I think at about the time I did it, at least a dozen people had already done, continuous rounds of the Munros. Mm. But no one had included all the subsidiary tops as well, which adds a few hundred summits.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the difference between the sort of the Munro list, the full list, effectively, and the Reverend Robinson list. Is that have I got that right?
No. Munro originally compiled a table of 3,000-foot summits. Uh-huh. And he divided those summits into what he called separate mountains and subsidiary tops. Uh-huh. And I forget, there were about 519 originally, and something like 276, I think, he called separate mountains. Yeah. Now, he didn't call them Munros.
No.
That came afterwards, but what came afterwards was the separate mountains became known as Munros. Mm. And the Reverend A.E. Robertson was the first person to climb all the Munros. Right. He didn't bother with the tops.
No.
Shortly afterwards, the Reverend A.R. Byrne did the tops as well, but they didn't do them as continuous walks. They were doing them over a number of years,
right,
on day trips and overnight trips and so on. And then it was Hamish Brown who, in I think 1976, did a continuous walk over the Munros, which had been attempted, I think, at least once before, but people hadn't succeeded.
Sure. And I was going to ask you, obviously, the Hamish Brown, record, if you want to call it that, was important to you, or was an inspiration?
Well, yeah. It was one of the ways I discovered the Munros, I think, like many other people. And when I first came to Scotland, I'd never heard of the Munros. They were just hills, and I went up some of them.
Yeah.
But Hamish's book came out at around the same time, Hamish's Mountain Walk, and I read that and thought, oh, I'd love to do a walk like that. This is fantastic. And I did all the Munros, including, I did a couple of 500-mile walks over selections of them over the next few years. But it was quite a while later before I thought of doing a walk. And I included the tops because I didn't want, to redo Hamish's walk.
Yeah.
I was thinking, what can I add? I want to do something that makes it different. And I thought, well, let's add the tops. When you look in the list that the Scottish Mountaineering Club, keeps of Munroists, there is a column for the tops and a column. If you look in the early years, the 20s and 30s, there's not that many people did them then.
Right.
But most people did the tops as well. Sure. If you look over the last 20 years, hardly anybody does the tops.
Yeah, it's barely.
It's the Munros have become more significant. And the thing that's odd is, and one of the things that I like about the Munros, which makes them quirky, Munro never defined what the difference was between a mountain and a top, which has resulted in some tops have a bigger drop and a greater distance between them and their parent Munro than there is between two Munros.
Right.
It's not a logical list.
Right. So there's that's sort of his own sort of idiosyncrasy.
Yeah.
That sort of makes. I suppose it makes it part of the character of the list in a way. Yeah.
And it's been revised a few times, which is always controversial. Yeah. But Munro, when he died, he was in the midst of revising the list. Okay. And he'd made some changes, so quite clearly he was not against it being revised.
Right.
Okay.
And
it has been revised since. I mean, some of the revisions are because better measurement has meant that some hills that were thought to be under 3,000 feet have been discovered to be more than 3,000 feet, and some that the other way round.
Sure.
But also, in some places, people have looked at hills and said, why is there only one Munro? This is ridiculous. There should be two. And so they've been added.
Yeah. And I noticed when I was reading around that you travelled by bike when you did your Munro round.
Yeah, only on road sections. And again, I took, this is what Hamish Brown did.
Yeah.
So I took it, I wanted it all to be self-powered, but some of the Coolin on Skye, Benmore on Mull, these are a long way. And from other places, and I thought, I don't want to be walking 30, 40 miles on highways.
But I'll
cycle that bit.
It was important to you that it was self-powered.
Yes, other than the ferries.
Yeah.
I mean, some people have done the Munros and canoed or
nobody swam
across these bits.
No.
I think somebody might have done actually, but not with the tops as well. But I felt, I was. If Hamish could use a bike, and I think he used the bike more than I did actually.
I think he did. I think you're right. Yeah, from what I read. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean,
but self-powered was important because that keeps it as a continuous trip.
Yeah.
You haven't got, other than the ferries, you haven't got any sections where, you got the bus or you got a car, you drove there in the car or something. It's, everything that was on land was self-powered.
It's certainly something that's important to me, I think, is how I get there, or if you kind of, there shouldn't be a difference, or as little a difference as possible in my mind. And you mentioned the Rockies. I mean, that just sounds like an absolute epic, an opus of a journey.
Yeah, yes, it was.
How long did that take?
It took about 4.5 months, 1,600 miles, but it really divided into two very different walks. It was curious. In most of the southern half of the Canadian Rockies, there are national parks or wilderness areas. And in these, you've got good trails, well maintained. In the parks, you've got backcountry campsites. You've got trail signs.
Sure.
So whilst there's an awful lot of up and down, I wouldn't describe the walking as easy, and you can be carrying quite a lot of days' food. You don't really have navigation problems. You don't have camping problems. There's no difficulties with the terrain. You're on a good footpath. The northern 800 miles of the Canadian Rockies, there's virtually nothing, including paths, so it changes completely. I mean, I did not see another walker for that 800 miles at all. There were hardly any trails.
Wow. So that really is you in terms of your kind of your feeling of wilderness, your kind of being in the land. That's a real, you certainly must have got that there.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's times in the north where you're 100 miles from the nearest road.
Right.
It's very, very wild,
yeah.
remote country.
Is it important to you that, because obviously there's this whole idea of Munro bagging, and obviously you've mentioned that you wanted to do something a bit different to Hamish's round. Is it important to you that it should be a record, or is it?
No.
It's not about that.
No, it's not about that. I mean, the people who are interested in the records always put time into the equation as well.
Right.
So I think the record for the Munros is 47 days or something amazing like that, which is done by a runner with a support team. It's not walking at all.
With over 1 million listeners worldwide, The Outdoor Station is the leading online audio resource for those into the great outdoors.
None of the long walks I've done have I ever wanted to do them, as quickly as possible or faster than other people. And in fact, I positively haven't, in that I've never wanted to do a long walk where I'd set myself, well, I've got to do 30 miles every day, come what may. So the pressure was always to do the mileage, and that's what constitutes success. I've always allowed enough time for them.
Sure.
That I don't have to do that. There may be some long days by choice, but I hate to do one where I've got this pressure to do the record, so I must keep going. But the reason for doing things, that either haven't been done before or have rarely been done before, is more the interest in it having, an exploratory feel, not something where I can follow it, from a guidebook or whatever.
Sure.
Now, some of the big trails in the States, it's simply that, like the Pacific Northwest Trail, that they haven't really been developed. So that even though they've got a name and there's a line on a map, it's not actually there on the ground. So you get that feel anyway, even though it's got the trail name. But also the thing with the Munros, it links in with the wild country thing. In the Highlands, the wildest places are the summits, generally. So that's where I like to go. I mean, on most of all the long walks I've done abroad, which have been in, much remoter, wilder places, I've never climbed many summits because those places are wild below the summits as well. So, that's one reason for doing the Munros.
So it's really about this sort of experience and how that feels, and that's your priority.
Yes.
When you obviously, because constructing something like this and planning something like this is it's going to take some time, and these very long trips. I mean, are you strict with yourself when you're out there, or do you allow some flexibility?
Flexibility in what way?
Well, in terms of, obviously you're going to have your food on your back. There's a lot of planning that goes into the trip and stages, presumably, to resupply. And do you build in some time, or is it kind of other?
Oh, in that sense, I'm very flexible. I'm so flexible. I know some Lotting's walkers would say you're disorganised.
Okay.
Some people like to plan the whole walk in detail. I don't. Again, because of the exploratory thing. So what I like to do is think, where can I resupply? Do I have to send supplies there, or can I buy it when I get there? Right, what's the distance between? That'll probably take so many days, so I'll take that much food and 1 or 2 days extra and set off. I don't plan it in detail. I've seen people, with spreadsheets, exactly how far they're going every day, down to 0.1 of a mile, and where they're going to camp every night, and exactly what food they're going to have, and so on. Because again, I only send food to myself if it's to places where I can't buy it. Otherwise, I take potluck. I'll turn up at a town or village, and I'll resupply with whatever they happen to sell there.
Sure.
And sometimes, you can't decide this is what I must have because you might not be able to get it.
Yeah, of course. And you get to try the local, cuisine anyway here.
And I think as well, which is significant to some extent, you're also giving some support to the communities you're going through.
Yeah.
If all you do is buy all your food in a big city, put it in cardboard boxes, post it to the post office and collect it, you're not putting anything into those communities.
And of course you're interacting with the community as well. You're meeting, you're purchasing, of course. It's a consumer relationship, but it's also a friendships and networks.
Oh, you get to talk to people. You're part.
It's just another big part of any journey as well is kind of people that you meet and people that you meet by accident as well as the people you might meet on purpose.
Oh yeah, the people you meet by accident. One of the on big trails like the Appalachian Trail in the States, which thousands of people do every year, and it has a whole support network built around it. And obviously there's towns along the way for whom it's highly important because that's a lot of people coming through. They talk there about the idea of trail angels, which are basically local people who will go out of their way to help hikers, at no benefit to themselves, not people who are selling them things or whatever. But what I've found with long-distance walks is everywhere I've been, in general, most people you meet are friendly and helpful and will often go out of their way, to assist you. So it's also, this was not something I ever thought of course, with long-distance walking, but it's actually a good way to feel optimistic about humanity. Yeah. Because you think, no, I'm meeting people who've, from different countries who know nothing about me, never met before. I've turned up. I'm dirty and sweaty because I've been on the trail for the last 10 days, and so on. And I've talked to them, and they're immediately offering help. Yeah. And assistance and asking if they can do anything or making suggestions and so on. And, and that happens regularly. Yeah. And it happens everywhere. Sure. I haven't done a long distance walk everywhere where it hasn't happened. Right. And of all the walking I've done, I'd have to go through all my journals to find all the occasions when this has happened. The number of times I've met people who have been in any way unhelpful, I can count on the fingers of one hand. It's hardly ever happened.
Greatly outweighed by the sort of the assistance that you've had and the sort of the friendships that you've made on the way. Yeah. And do you keep in touch with the odd person?
Keep in touch with some, yes. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, back to the sort of the psychological differences between a day trip and a longer trip. Do you think, are you able to say?
Yes. I can try anyway.
Yeah, please.
I think it's, it's a qualitative difference, and this is to do with time, not distance. Yeah. Distance doesn't really matter. It's the time you're out there. And I think one of the things is, on a day trip or an overnight trip, it's a short burst of experience and then it's over. Uh-huh. And the rest of the time you're doing something different. When you do a long walk, a multi-week walk, and I'd say you've got to be talking about a minimum of 3 to 4 weeks, and that's probably not long enough. Uh-huh. It ceases to be a short burst of experience and it becomes what you do. Mm. If you know that for the next 2, 3, 4 months, this is what you're going to be doing. Mm. You're going to be walking in the wilderness and camping out at night. Then, as that becomes what you do and not a short burst, first of all, the pressure to get the maximum out of it, because you'll be, back home, back in the office, back in the car or whatever, that evening or the next day, has gone. And I think that means you can take things in, more deeply. There's also the fact that initially, I find on any long walk, extraneous details are important. How far can I walk? Will I find water? Where will I camp? All sorts of different things like that. Can I navigate through this terrain okay? Can I find a route? That settles down after a week or two, and you stop worrying about those. Because you know that, you'll sort it out. It'll work out, and sometimes some of these things might be more difficult than others, but you stop thinking about them, so you can be totally involved in the experience of it. In other words, you feel comfortable with being where you are and with moving through the wilds.
The trail will provide, sometimes I've heard said.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
But no, it's very interesting that I think the longest I've walked is for sort of 2.5 weeks. And certainly that felt very different to me. That was just, it's a drop in the ocean compared to what you're talking about, but it felt very different to anything I'd done before. And the sort of the little details become sort of, the small things become very, very sort of significant. They're kind of, very, very interesting.
Yes,
so,
yeah. Yeah, I think that's important as well. Yeah, you start to notice the details. If you're only out for a day, you notice the overall landscape. The mountains are spectacular, or the forests are spectacular.
Sure.
When you're out, as you say, for weeks, then the details of individual trees and rocks and other things also become important. Yeah. You're looking at everything because you're seeing the spectacular landscape every day.
Sure.
So you don't need to just think about that.
Yeah. I guess maybe some of the wow factor goes, but then you're looking for you get to notice all the other stuff. Yeah,
exactly. That's what I mean about. I think you get more immersed in it.
Yeah, I loved my dip in the toe of slightly longer walking. It was kind of because all of that happened, and I totally agree. I think it's about time, this sort of thing that happens, sort of duration, and how your brain processes that, and it's hugely interesting to me. Hopefully there'll be many more of those.
You're listening to the award-winning UK Business Podcaster of the Year,
the home of UK-based audio and video podcasts for lovers of the great outdoors everywhere.
Podcasts are based solely around self-powered travel.
This is the Outdoor Station.
I have a feeling I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you get lonely ever when you're walking?
No. I'm often asked that, or have been over the years. I have to admit, I don't even fully understand the question because it doesn't arise. It's never been a problem for me. I've not had to deal with it. If I'm in when I'm in wild places, there is so much to see and do.
Yeah.
That I've
really
never felt lonely. I can get. If there's, which on any long walk, you occasionally get, bits of road walking, something like, dirt roads or highway or whatever, I can get bored, which is different.
Yeah.
But no, I don't get lonely.
And when you come back, come back to Scotland and to home, I know that other long distance walkers, when they return, sometimes there's obviously a reacclimatisation period, and some people complain of they have a period of depression, or they might feel a bit alienated. Is that something you've experienced, or these kind of feelings, or?
No, but I think what you're coming back to matters. I mean, I'm coming back to the Highlands, not to a big city.
Sure.
And I'm coming back to do work that's to do with the outdoors anyway. I can imagine that, if you're coming back to a job in an office in a big city that has no connection, with the outdoors, then yes, there's going to be a lot of dislocation and it could be difficult and you're going to, miss an awful lot. So I can understand how that happens, but it hasn't, again, it's because I've tried to make the things I do in the outdoors what I do all the time. Yeah. It's not the same for me as it is perhaps for other people.
Yeah, there's this phrase, cognitive dissonance. I don't know if you know that, which is...
Yes.
Yeah, and I think it sounds like you might have certainly minimised that, the effect of that. Yeah, it's just, fantastic. It's, obviously, an aim for many, I would hope, and I'm sure it is, yeah. This practice of walking for a really for a long way, but for a long time, really. That's sort of what you were saying. What does that tell you? The fact that that's, I guess, more of an unusual thing than it probably was in the past. What does that tell you about the way a lot of us do live? The fact that, the majority of humanity, I think it's just over half now, are urbanised. That it's more unusual now than perhaps it was. People are making less pilgrimages.
Yes, I think it probably is in one sense, though as a recreational activity, it's probably, there's more people doing it now than ever before. Right. But I think what has changed is doing physical work is far more unusual for most people. Right. I mean, most people are not doing much with their bodies. And obviously long-distance walking is part of that. But also you've got the fact that, in the past, most people have worked on the land. And that has gone as well. And I certainly think, bodies are meant to be used, or if you like, need to be used. And again, I see this on long distance walks. Another thing that happens for me after 2 to 3 weeks is I start to feel, physically and mentally fit. And that will continue for the rest of the walk. So there's a feeling of, if you like, rightness. This is appropriate. This is what I should be doing. And I'm sure a lot of that does come from the physical side of things.
Sure.
Your on a long distance walk, your body is active. 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever hours a day, every day. And that makes a huge difference from the way most people live most of the time.
I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did, and thanks of course to Chris and David for sharing. You can find out more from them on their individual websites, of course. Chris Townsend outdoors.com and David is selfpowered.blogspot.com. There's 2 more interviews coming soon from Chris and David, so make sure you keep an eye on the Outdoor Station website and in iTunes, of course, to get them as soon as they arrive. So until next time, folks, just get out there and keep walking.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To hear more from our extensive free library, please visit the website at theoutdoorstation.co.uk.
You can now follow The Outdoor Station on Facebook, where we chat about each programme we produce, answer questions and discuss future productions. Why not join us there?
This podcast is produced and hosted by theoutdoorstation.co.uk.